Everyone, and welcome to Reconcile or Bust, the GP date adventure to data consistency. Um, my name is Kyle Rehome. I am a senior consultant here at Stone Ridge Software, specializing in the Dynamics GP product. I've been working with Dynamics GP for well over 10 years now. I live up in Fargo, North Dakota. I started at the Microsoft campus up here and then began working with Stone Ridge after that and just have kind of hung out here since then. Um, I'm a huge lover of anything sci-fi or fantasy related. Had a lot of Lord of the Rings and Fifth Element references in our wedding ceremony. So, those are the sort of things that my wife and I enjoy here. And I really enjoy digging into data and building reports that people to help people show exactly um, what they're wanting in the format that they're needing. Some of the things that we'll talk about here with the Reconcile utilities today, I often find myself, kind of investigating and trying to figure out on my own. So, um, you know, for better or worse, kind of trying to do what these tools are intended to help automate and make your life easier. Today we're going to be talking about the Reconcile utilities within GP. We'll go through an overall overview of what those utilities are, and then we'll go through module by module and talk about the specific Reconcile utilities that are within each module. Then we'll also talk about the Reconcile to GL routine, which is to help us balancing between the general ledger and the subledgers. And then we'll have some time for questions and answers after that. So our executive summary of what we're trying to get out of our session today, we really want to be able to know where the various reconcile utilities are within GP and know when to use each one, since there are quite a wide variety. Being able to identify when it's appropriate to use them, and how when they can help is really important. Our goal is to help us quickly fix data discrepancies. So rather than spending time like I might do digging into the data behind a transaction that doesn't look quite right, let's learn how to use these reconcile utilities to help fix those a little bit quicker. And then we want to learn to take the appropriate precautions before running reconcile. Some of them are a little bit more impactful than others, so um, we want to know when it's good to take a backup versus or when we need to have everyone out of the system, or if it's a smaller reconcile utility that we can just kind of run on our own. um, you know we want to be able to make people say we were able to get the batches posted before month end. When it's the end of the month and you've got these batches that you can't post with weird transactions and stuff like that, that's where we want to be able to use these reconcile tools. And then at the end of today's conversation, if you want to talk about the Reconcile utilities more or understand more in depth about them, or just have other questions, reach out to support@stoneridgesoftware.com. That's going to, get a hold of me along with the rest of our consultant team, and we'll help answer any questions that you do have. So first of all, what is Reconcile? These are utilities to help you save time and correct data. So Reconcile is it's used as a cross-check of summary information against the specific detailed transactions that are out in GP. GP is going through and kind of recalculating things and double checking to make sure all the details get you to the same point as what you're seeing, when you're looking at a summary window or kind of that header information on a transaction. So within GP, most of the time you'll find under the specific module that you're working with in the utilities section, you will see the reconcile utility available there. Um, these were designed to help you fix and correct issues when maybe something didn't update correctly during transaction posting. We'll talk about some more specifics on that. So with Reconcile, these changes that are being made by the system are permanent. So it is always a good idea to have, a database backup in place in case something were to change that you weren't expecting. Granted, Reconcile is always intending to fix things, but I have seen scenarios where we fix something that we maybe have already compensated for or have already fixed in previous attempts, and now fixing it the proper way causes other issues. So sometimes you get into trouble with that, which is why, especially if you're running a bigger reconcile process, make sure you have that backup available. And reconcile can be run on a regular basis. You may see some documentation or notes out there that say, run reconcile during year-end time, or once a month when you're doing your month-end closing, and that can be okay depending upon what type of issues you're dealing with. Generally, I only look to run reconcile when I know, or at least think, that there may be data issues, and that's just more of a headache saver of um, if you're not really noticing the issues, then maybe it's not worth the time to run those routines. So and some of the processes can take a long time to run. We'll talk about the inventory reconcile, which, if you're running that for all your items, that could be a huge process, and does kind of, prevent folks from being in the system while you're running it. So always things to think about when you are planning to run those reconcile utilities. So now let's kind of go through module by module and talk about what each of the individual reconcile utilities will do. So the first that we'll talk about is the financial process. So under tools, utilities, and then the financial module, you'll see reconcile. Um, this one only has three options. The first option is to reconcile allocation accounts. So this is to go through and check your allocation accounts, both variable and fixed allocation accounts. Make sure all the accounts are still valid and active. Distribution accounts are correct. Things like that. So if you are setting up or using a lot of allocation accounts, this might be a good process to run. Um, to reconciling the year is probably the most common thing that you'll do in this window if you're using it. This goes through and recalculates all of your summary balances for your general ledger accounts based on the individual transactions. So if you're ever looking in a summary inquiry report window and you notice that the balance that you see in there is different than all of the individual transactions, that's a good time to run this reconcile utility. Um, also, you may consider doing this if you make changes to your fiscal year, or have to maybe undo and redo your year-end close, things like that. You'll run that year reconcile. If you are running it for multiple years, you always want to start with the oldest year first and move forward. And actually, in newer versions of GP, you'll actually see there's an option, rather than choosing an open or history year, you can actually just choose all years and it will reconcile starting from the oldest year going forward. The last option you'll see in this window is to reconcile batches. This is to go through and update and verify the batch totals and number of transactions are actually equal to what's in the batches. So if you ever have a batch where you know that there's 10 transactions in here, but that batch summary window is only showing 8, or the total is wrong, run this to update that information. One thing to note with this window that's a little unique, there is no report that generates after you run the routine. There is no progress bar. It just kind of does its thing and then you move on. So when you go to reconcile, you click that button, you'll see your cursor kind of go into the thinking mode. And then once it's done thinking, GP's done reconciling. So this one's a little bit strange in that regard. Next, we'll talk about reconciling the payables, or in payables. So under the purchasing module, utilities, and then reconcile, you'll find this option, or this window. So here we get a little bit more in depth in what we can actually choose to reconcile. So the first thing you'll want to consider is what range of accounts do you want to reconcile. So you can reconcile, you know, one specific vendor ID, or you could do a range of vendors or all vendors. You could filter by your vendor class, your payment priority, things like that. So this window gives us a little bit more flexibility in choosing, that subset of data that we actually do want to reconcile. Um, in this window, you'll also see there's options at the bottom to reconcile and also to print report. So here, if you just want to preview, what sort of data is actually going to change, you can uncheck that reconcile checkbox and just have it print the report. And then you'll get to see, if you were to run Reconcile, here's the things that GP is going to identify and fix. So that's a really good precaution. Once you've been able to verify all that, then go ahead and run this process again with that Reconcile checkbox marked, and GP will actually go through and make the changes. So the things that we can actually reconcile in this window, I'll talk about a few of them. So one is summary information. So this is to update your unapplied payment amounts, unpaid finance charges, current balances, on order amounts, things like that. So if there's ever an issue with like a transaction where you've applied X dollars to it, but it's still showing the full amount available or a full amount remaining, that's where you reconcile that summary um, option, and that'll kind of go back through and double check those numbers. Um, if you choose to reconcile fiscal year or calendar year, they're kind of the same. They really recalculate those vendor balances for the selected fiscal year or for the selected calendar year. So that is, if your vendor should have this balance, all the transactions add up to that balance, but that's just not what's showing when you look at like a vendor inquiry window. That's where you want to run this routine. And then here, we also have the option to reconcile batches, very similar to general ledger. This will update those batch headers, and make sure those totals on the batch are correct. This is helpful if your batch looks like it's missing transactions, or if you're doing, if you need approvals and verification on those batch totals before posting. Sometimes if things are out of alignment, you just have to run this reconcile utility to fix that. So also in the purchasing module, but on the other side with purchase order processing, we have the option to reconcile purchasing documents. So this is a separate window, and this looks at exclusively at purchase orders. We're going to update the header information on those unposted purchase orders to match up with the line items that are out there. So this is useful if you ever notice, when you go to print a purchase order and there's errors showing on the lines of, your distributions don't match the totals or something like that. If there isn't an actual issue with the distributions, sometimes those numbers in the background that you don't get to see all the time, might just be out of line. And that's where this reconcile purchasing documents will help out with that. So this is a really good tool, if you've got purchase orders that you're trying to transfer to invoice, or sorry, getting my sales and purchasing confused. But yeah, those purchasing documents that maybe you can't receive everything that you expect, or can't invoice everything you expect. Maybe there is an issue with that purchase order. And so that's where you would run this routine to try to fix those. And now moving over to the sales side of things, we've got the reconcile receivable amounts. So this is under utilities, sales, and then reconcile. Similar to our purchasing reconciliation, we can choose to reconcile a range of customers. So we can select a specific customer ID, name, type, reconcile by salesperson or sales territory, whichever you may be needing. Again, we have the options to be able to just print the report as well as actually reconcile. So use that to your advantage to kind of verify the totals and the changes that we're going to look at making. And then the options in this window for reconciliation, the first is to reconcile the current customer information. So this is similar on the payable side where we got to update those balances. This is going and checking outstanding documents for a customer, verify that those balances are updated. It's essentially the same as running the aging routine. So it does ask for that reconcile date, which is basically your age as of date. So when it's putting balances into your aging buckets, it does utilize that date as well. So you have to fill that in if you're choosing to reconcile current customer information. Then there's also the option to reconcile outstanding document amounts. This is similar again on the payable side where that amount remaining or that applied amount on a document is not quite right. Use this to fix that. It balances the applied information for a document against what's actually there. I see this often used if had to unapply a credit or something like that, or often if you're entering cash receipts and you go to apply something and then maybe that cash receipt doesn't save or you have to delete it. Sometimes the what you were trying to apply to, might still think it's tied up, even though there's nothing actually applied. That's where if you run this reconcile routine or utility, this will help fix that. We also have batch information, fiscal year and calendar year, just like what we've seen before. That's updating, those summary balances and that batch header information. So you could go ahead and use those whenever you need. And then on the sales order processing side, the window here is named a little deceptively. It is called reconcile dash remove sales documents. So it's actually a two function window. One is you can use it to reconcile sales documents, which will, just like on the purchase order side, go through and update header information, make sure distributions are matching with totals on the document, things like that. This is again, if you're trying to transfer an order to an invoice or something like that, and it's just not working, your batch isn't giving you that information. Sometimes running this reconcile sales documents utility will fix those. We also have the option in here to remove completed sales documents, and this removes those completed sales orders from an open to history status. So if you're have that option marked to keep history for sales order documents, then it'll just move those into the history status. And that helps with just cleanup of your lookup windows and things like that. Um, Again, we have that option in here to print the report only versus actually running the reconcile. So use that to your advantage to help you identify what's actually going to change before you commit to that reconcile process. Now, our next big module that we are going to talk about is inventory, and this is the option to reconcile inventory quantities. So this is a pretty big one, especially if you're using inventory, a lot. You've probably run this one before or are familiar with it. Um, so this allows you to select a specific range of items or well, just a range of items, and then go through and verify and update your current quantities for on hand, allocated, available through each inventory site. So the biggest thing about this one is you cannot run this while there are any sort of transactions being entered. So if there's any user in any sort of window, that deals with inventory, purchase order processing, sales order processing, manufacturing, any of those windows, it won't let you run this routine. Um, it will also stop users from entering any new transactions while this utility is running. So typically that means we're wanting to run this after hours, once we know everyone's out of the system and once we know no one's going to need to be in the system entering anything to do with inventory. Um, this can be a little bit tricky too because it's either people aren't logging out all the way or sometimes their user their login records are getting stuck and they're stuck in one of those windows that makes GP think they're doing or they're doing an inventory transaction. If that's the case, you probably need to work with your IT or contact us here at Stoneridge to help you clear out those activity records that we know aren't valid anymore so that you can run this utility. And if you have a large inventory, you may even need to consider breaking this up into multiple sessions. Um, I've definitely worked with customers where this takes 24 to 36 hours to run or longer. So if you've got a lot of inventory, there's probably a lot behind it, and Reconcile can definitely take a long time to do that. It does print a report at the end that shows all the changes, so that's very nice. But again, this is a pretty big one where you really want to set aside time, make sure you have database backup, all that sort of thing, ready to go. So there are a couple of other modules that do have reconciles, but they're really not used that often. Fixed assets has some reconciled utilities. But again, that's mostly more just verifying setup records and things like that. I don't know that I've ever actually needed to run any in fixed assets. There also are reconciles within payroll and human resources. That's dealing on US payroll at least. I can't necessarily speak to Canadian payroll. Again, and it same concepts where we're balancing those employee totals for the year, or with the HR reconcile, if you're, wanting to make sure all of your HR information is synchronized with payroll, that's what those are used for. If you do have a need for those, or maybe wondering more about those, definitely reach out and let me know. I'd be happy to talk about them, but I know they're a little bit more niche, and so I didn't want to take up time here today to talk about them. So now we're then going to talk about the reconcile to GL routine, which is a tool for helping us balance our subledgers. So the reconcile to GL routine is found under the routine section of the financial module. It's called reconcile to GL. What this tool does is um, ultimately provides us with a Excel spreadsheet of all the transactions within a chosen subledger and the corresponding general ledger accounts. So this is balancing your, control accounts that are dealing with payables, receivables, inventory, or bank reconciliation. So those are kind of the four subledgers that we have available. It can reconcile to multiple general ledger accounts. So we'll see in the next window what the actual setup window looks like, and you'll be able to choose, what are those accounts that we're reconciling to. We choose the date range that we want to reconcile. Typically, we're looking to just do 1 month at a time, but there are maybe some scenarios where it's beneficial to try to look at a larger time period, just to see if they're probably one of the more common things is like a transaction posted in payables at the end of February, but it didn't post to the general ledger until the beginning of March. Well, in that scenario, our payables balance is different than our GL balance, and we're going to see those show up as unmatched if we're just running for 1 month time period. So it shows us our matched transactions. So ones that where GP was able to apply its logic and say, yes, I see it in payables and I see it on the general ledger. There's potentially matched transactions, which in almost every scenario I've ever seen, those are matched effectively. It just means that using the logic that's built in, it couldn't 100% say that they're matched, but I would say it's a 95% match. And then finally, the unmatched transactions. So these are transactions that show up in our payable subledger, but there's no matching general ledger transaction for the accounts that we selected and in the time frame that we selected. So this is a tool, unlike the Reconcile utilities. This tool is strictly to help us identify problems, but doesn't do anything to actually fix them. So it's just going to give us a list of those transactions that we should be looking at and verifying, are the dates matching up? Did this transaction go to the right GL accounts? Did it, trying to think of other scenarios, was it a manual journal entry that went to our control GL accounts and it really should have gone through the payable subledger? All these sort of things, it's helping us identify those so that we can then help to figure out what corrections need to be made to fix our subledger to GL balancing. The article that I have listed here, you can find it on Microsoft's site or do some searching about it. We'll go into great detail of all the things that this routine is looking for to match up those transactions, and then some of those common things that reasons why they might be unmatched transactions or not matching up completely. So here's what the window looks like to actually set up this reconcile to GL. So you can see kind of starting from the top, the reconciliation number is just how many times have you run this routine? It doesn't really matter, but it allows you to go back and look at historical processes. The date is, again, what date are we actually running the reconcile? Um, the date range is then what range are we looking at to try to balance these accounts? Um, And then you get to choose the module below that. So that has the drop down for payables, receivables, inventory, and fixed assets. Or excuse me, no, bank reconciliation, not fixed assets. And then once you select that, on the right is where you're going to see the accounts. And GP knows, based on the setup that you have in the system, what are those control accounts that we should be using. But if you need to add or remove any to that list, you can do that. And then the output file is where it's actually going to create the Excel file, once this is all, once we actually process this. So make sure that you choose a location that you have access to, on your desktop, a shared drive, something like that. And then what we actually get as an output is this Excel file that we see here. Um, and so on the left, those are all of our transactions from the receivable subledger in this case that are out there. On the right are all the general ledger transactions. The balances that we see at the top and at the bottom of this report, I usually don't take much stock in those. I'm running this once I've identified that there's an issue with the balances, and those beginning balances are just not reliable. I really want to just use the actual transaction matching feature of this utility, to help us out. And so in this first section here, you can see we've got two transactions that are unmatched, meaning that they have transactions within the receivable subledger, but it didn't hit any of those general ledger account that we have set up. And so what's really nice about this spreadsheet is that you can actually drill back on any of these fields that are blue text. Those are hyperlinks that'll take you right back into GP and let you see that transaction and start digging into it. So again, this could be, did it post to the wrong GL accounts? Did it go to a different month? Or maybe it didn't make it to the GL at all. All things that we can start digging into based off of this information. And then the potentially matched and matched section, most of the time I'm not worried or looking at those, but they can help you to just kind of confirm everything did hit between the subledger and the general ledger. So that about wraps everything up of what we're going to talk about here today. Stone Ridge is here to support you with any of these utilities or routines or anything else that you need. If these reconcile processes aren't fixing what you expect it to, give us a shout and let us dig into it and help you figure out what is going on. So we do a lot of other things, but that's what we kind of feature and really enjoy doing is helping you solve those problems that are giving you a challenge.